you've got to be a masochist, or you've got to have some niche product where you've got, 10x markups, like, some skateboard, with art printed on it or something, right? I mean, if you've got like normal products like a broom, you've got to be absolutely insane if you're going to manufacture that in the US. And so, broadly speaking, anything that removes those domestic handicaps, I am a huge, huge fan of. Now, if we talk about the tariffs versus income tax trade-off, the first thing is that it's not science fiction. That's how the country worked in the late 19th century, which is really the golden age of American growth. I mean, it was the golden age of all of human history. If you look at the period from about 1870 to about 1910, when the progressives destroyed it, everything was getting better just so fast. It was incredible. When you look at science fiction of the era and they predicted flying cars and all this, and then people say, they were so naive. No, they weren't naive. They were precisely on track. We destroyed it. Our ancestors, our grandparents destroyed it. So if you look back at that era, like the 1880s, our federal government was almost entirely funded by import tariffs. And, if we sort of translate what those import tariffs would do in a modern age, back then they were about 30%. Apparently, things did not fall apart. We did not have stagflation. On the contrary, we had Singapore levels of economic growth, along with falling prices, which was actually great, right? So everybody got rich really fast. So apparently we can sustain that level, call it 30% tariffs across the board. If we were to do that today, we import about $4 trillion in goods and services. If you put a 30% tax on that, it would go down. So, maybe maybe it would go down to 3.2 something, in which case you'd be raising about $1 trillion in revenue. The current income tax takes about 2.8 trillion, right? So you would have a reduction in government revenue by about 1.8 trillion. If they were prudent, which is a big if, then of course they would reduce spending in line with that. And so we would get a much smaller federal government. If we had a much smaller federal government, then you have fewer bureaucrats creating these new regulations and harassing businesses. And of course, the main benefit is that if you don't have an income tax, then it becomes much more attractive to run a small business here. So if we imagine America where you've got, say, 1/10 as many EPA and OSHA and whatnot regulators. Okay, so if you cut those by 90%, you do a Javier Milei afuera type, throw those guys out. And on top of that, if you had zero income tax, well, at that point, it would be crazy to make a broom in China. You'd make it here in America, right? So I think absolutely, it's a fantastic idea. It's never ever going to pass because it's too good. It's like ending the Fed. It's just an amazing idea across the board, but it's too good for Washington. And unfortunately, those kinds of obviously good ideas, they probably won't come in unless we have some sort of crisis in Washington where you get like a great reset. If they keep cheating, right, then we'll probably get there sooner than later, actually, ironically, because, each time that people sort of get more and more extreme, if you shut them up, then they just, they actually start to get more and more extreme. And then when finally sort of the spring pops up, then it can be a lot more dramatic and we get a bigger change. I was at a talk, this a couple of years ago in Canada, and the former, who was the Canadian Prime Minister before Trudeau? Harper. And Harper is kind of he's like a middle of the road conservative. He would be a rhino in the US without a doubt. And Harper was giving a talk where he was talking about Trump. And, I assumed, okay, he's just going to trash the guy. But actually, he said, you can't silence somebody like Trump because he's speaking for a large percent of the population who's very frustrated. And if you shut him up, then you're not going to like what comes next, right? So I think we're at that stage where a contrarian or an accelerationist would almost root for them to cheat at this point, because that gets us closer to a state break where you can get ideas like ending the Fed or Bitcoin legal tender, or, trading out the income tax for tariffs, where those things do actually become a possibility.
I wish it didn't have to come to that. I wish
for sure
Trump could come in like Alfware, just cut everything.
We lost that battle. Yeah, between public education, the progressives, Dewey and them, and again about 1910s, public education, which of course was state indoctrination, and then mass media, where for the first time you had this very, very concentrated ownership of really sort of the opinion molding of society. And mass media, obviously, the first thing they did was made friends with government and cut deals, licensing, censoring the competition. And so between those two, mass media and education, and then out of that fell different things. They captured institution after institution, like universities. And we discovered during COVID, apparently they had captured freaking everything, like the National Bookbinders Association of America had opinions about BLM, and you're like, what? Like, when did you guys get captured by Marxists? But there we were. But yeah, so unfortunately, it'd be really nice if we were back in like 1870, where you could talk to regular voters and they had a brain. But we've fallen quite a bit. I actually did a study a couple of years ago. Study is a grand word. I went through and correlated. I looked at every state of the inauguration address. So every inauguration address of every president since 1900. And if you go back, right, that was before public education. So in theory, everybody was illiterate, right? And so you go back to 1900, 1904. And remember, if you're in an inaugural address, those are written by professional speechwriters who are aiming at the 50th percentile of voters, right? They're not aiming at PhDs. They're trying to speak to voters because what they're trying to do is, to gain enough popularity that they can muscle Congress to get stuff passed. So anyway, you've got these inaugural addresses. And back in 1900, 1904, the inaugural addresses were running at, if you run them through Flesch-Kincaid grade level scores, okay, to sort of estimate the grade level that these things are written at, they're written at like 13th, 14th grade. In other words, college. All right, so the median American in 1900 was college educated equivalent. All right. Now, you can then carry that forward, and it is a stunning straight line decline. By the time you get to Trump, it was something like 8th grade. Obama was 8th grade. Trump was like 6th grade. And then Biden was like 4th grade. All right. So, and you can try this at home. You can run the inaugural speeches through Flesch-Kincaid. It is stunning. So there's this theory in sociology that we've all gotten smarter, I guess, because of the internet or TV or whatever. It is false. Certainly when it comes to policy matters, the voters have just been absolutely gutted, intellectually gutted. If you look at what happened in COVID, that seems to have accelerated. So I fear for the next generation of voters. But yes, it would be wonderful if we could have these adult conversations like we used to. The 1890s, you read like monetary debates in the 1890s, and most PhD economists would not be able to follow them. And these were public, right? These were in newspapers. These were aimed at average median voters. So, but unfortunately, it's fallen so far that I think that it's probably going to take a pretty big crisis to break. The crisis doesn't necessarily have to be existential, right? So 1970s was a big enough crisis that it led to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, I think, dramatically underestimated the scale and powers of the swamp. So he more or less bounced off without leaving a mark. Trump did a little bit better, but not a whole lot better, because I think even Trump didn't, he talked about the swamp, but I don't think he fully appreciated how deep that swamp was and how difficult it is to fight it on anything.